QSO Today, episode 447, Bob Vinikoor, W3CFE. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every week since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor button on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Bob Vinikoor, W3CFE, was inspired to become an amateur radio operator by his father, David, who held the first licensed W3CFE in 1935. Bob followed his technology and media interest into the satellite TV business, and later he became the owner of AM broadcasting stations in the New England states. Always active and on the air, Bob operates his remote Vermont ham radio station from around the world, and now from Israel. W3CFE is my QSO today. W3CFE, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Bob?
Roger, good to see you.
Bob, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I was 12 years old, living in Washington, D.C.
So your hometown was Washington, D.C.?
Yep. And my first call was KN3LJO. My dad was a ham. Actually, I'm using his call now. W3CFE is my dad's call.
So your dad was David?
David, and he was licensed in 1935.
And is there a story behind that? Your father, did he just have a technical interest? That seemed like that was a time, I remember the popular mechanics from those days. There was a lot of interest in technology in those days.
Yeah, it was in its infancy, radio, I guess, in those days. My dad worked as an electronic technician for the government in D.C. He was a tinkerer and fixed TVs on the side. And the cellar was, my job as a youngster was removing components from scrap TVs. I would cut the resistors and the capacitors and salvage the parts, which I don't think he ever used, but that was my job.
And it's my understanding that hams shut down during World War II and then kind of reactivated after World War II. Do you have any memories of that period of time?
No, I'm old, but...
Not that old.
I was born in 46, so when I became a ham was like 58. My dad, I think, had a technician license originally and then upgraded to a general when I got my general. And I was actually more active than my father was in ham radio. It turned out that.
Did he have a ham radio station at home when you were growing up?
We had a shack down the cellar. I'm sure he helped me, although I got my license, my Elmer. I didn't even use that term, but W3LKU. I remember he definitely was a technician. And he lived in the neighborhood, and I somehow wandered into his shack one day, and he was on 6 meters, and I think he was running a kilowatt on 6 meter FM. And you could smell the tubes gave off an aroma with the heat between the dankness of the cellar. And it was just, he helped me, gave me my novice license those days. Another ham, you didn't have to be a licensed examiner. You just, as long as you were a licensed ham, you could give the novice exam to someone.
I think you're the first guest that I've had that grew up in Washington, D.C. as a kid. And I'm interested, was there an electronics community in Washington, D.C., and were there like electronic stores that you would go to or hang out in?
Yeah, well, in Washington, we used to have surplus stores, and you can buy ARC 5s in the surplus stores. I don't know if you know what an ARC 5 is.
Sure.
Yeah. I think they had it was an 807 or a single tube transmitters, and you could pick them up for a couple bucks. So these were real military surplus, not stuff that came from China, and we call it surplus today. But and actually, the interesting thing, Eric, I took my license, my FCC, when I went for my general, at the FCC in Washington, D.C. It was a narrow little building, not like the portals or the M Street that they are today, but it was no wider than most apartments in Jerusalem and that bomb shelter we saw today. But there was a straight key, and I think it was a the CW was sent that you had to copy with a punch tape.
Right. As a matter of fact, it had a name, and it escapes me at the moment what the name of that machine was called.
Yeah, actually, I bought one at a ham fest a couple of years ago.
With a punch paper tape.
Punch paper tape with the reels for practicing code. I only bought it for nostalgia reasons, but anyhow, and you had to copy 100%, I believe. It was five character letter words, and you had 13 words a minute. I think you had to get the 100%. You couldn't get the meanings. You had to get every one of those letters right for at least, 5 minutes or something. I forget exactly what it was, but we just went down, a couple of friends of mine, and we took the test together and became hams.
I mean, you were in the golden age of kids joining ham radio, I think.
Oh, yeah, we started a ham club I went to Taft Junior High School in D.C., and we started a amateur radio club. Matter of fact, I gave the license exam. Well, maybe this could be nostalgia. Maybe I just inspired my science teacher, Mr. White, to get his license exam. I can't imagine a 12-year-old or 13-year-old kid could give an exam. So, but I think I inspired him to become Howard White became a ham. And we started a amateur radio club at the school, and it was different times.
Was Sputnik at all in the mindset of kids your age in those days?
I mean, I knew of it, but it wasn't part of ham radio. I don't believe in that in those days, at least my interest.
When you got your license, how old were you? You were 12 years old, did you say?
I got my novice license when I was 12 and my general when I was 13.
And what was your novice call sign?
KN3LJO, and then it became K3LJO. And actually, I looked at an old call book and I found it. You can find old call books online.
Right. And actually, that's how I found your dad's name, was in a 1935 call book.
Did you find it from 35?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Has him listed there. It's really cool.
I love it. I found it from the 60s. He still had his call, obviously, then. He died in 91.
So I should say that one of the reasons that we're speaking today and that I got to meet Bob is that Bob has moved to Jerusalem. So he and Howard Forex 1ZZ and I got together for coffee this afternoon and got a chance to look at some apartments, because Bob mentioned this just a little bit earlier, that at least for now, Bob is in Jerusalem and we've had a chance to have an eyeball over coffee. And Bob was kind enough to be my guest today on the QSO Today podcast. So you're now here, but let's just stay back in time for a little bit. What was your first rig as a novice operator in Washington, D.C.?
It was a DX35, a Heathkit DX35, and a BC 348 or 342, I forget. It was a receiver from a tank, and when you change bands, this thing would like click and the whole house would shift. It's crystal controlled, and when you finish sending CW, it was in my bedroom. It was on the second floor, row house on the corner. Crystal controlled, so when you call CW, you would tune. I mean, no one was on your frequency. You could tune 5 KCs up or down and hopefully hear somebody
calling you back.
Yeah, exactly.
So it actually prepared you for contest operation if you were operating CW during a contest, right?
Well, I never was a contester, but it's the way it started. I mean, CW is still it's sort of comfort food for me. I'm not that good at it, but just hearing CW straight key is meatloaf.
I noticed from your QRZ page that you still operate CW from time to time.
I do. I try to do a CW contact every day when I can.
Oh, good for you. What kind of antenna did your parents allow you to put on the row house in Washington?
I remember climbing on the roof. It was a it had a cellar and it was pretty high. And the access was on the second floor of the house. So I had a vertical. The solar cycle conditions were terrific in the early 60s. I mean, it was DX35, you could work the world. 10 meters was open, and this was all on AM, and it was amazing. Until I got a sideband generator, Central Electronics sideband generator. It just generated sidebands. It really wasn't a transmitter. You had to have an amplifier to go with it. Plug in coils. It was pretty primitive.
At the time, it was revolutionary. It's my understanding that Central Electronics sideband generator was using phasing or something like that for generating that single sideband.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it wasn't Collins gear. I guess KWM1s were there around then. I think they had sideband, but the ham radio has changed. You could be a ham then, and if you spent $100, it was a lot of money. Today, you might get a Kier for $100.
Or you could buy a QRP Labs CW kit for under $100. There are ways to get on the air even cheaper now. When you upgraded to a general, how did you upgrade the rig with the new privileges?
Bought a few more crystals to get outside the band. You used to have to order the crystals from Jan Crystal, and
right.
Actually, Jan is in Fort Myers. It was in Fort Myers, I believe. And I ended up living in Fort Myers prior to moving to Israel. So,
and there was International Crystal in those days?
Maybe International Crystal was out of Fort Myers, yeah.
I think there was Bomar Crystals at the time.
I remember International and Jan. Those are the two. I don't remember Bomar.
International Crystal was in Oklahoma City.
Okay. You're from out west. Probably where you ordered your crystals.
That's where I got my crystals, because when I first got in also, all the rigs, even the 2-meter rigs, were also crystal controlled.
Sure. Yeah.
If you had an ICOM IC22A in those days, then you'd actually buy 22 pairs of crystals for that radio to have all 22 channels in there. Yeah, that was a lot of crystals. That was a lot of money. When you thought about it, adding up all the crystals, you could have $400 in a radio in 1972, 73.
Yeah, it's a wonderful hobby. I've been in it for 76 now, so when I was 12, do the math, it's 63 years or 64 years. So
I'm curious, did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
I don't know if ham radio played the part.
Or the interest in electronics?
I was an AV geek in high school. You know, I ran the projectors and eventually went into instructional media in college and took, worked in college. And so, I've always been interested in radio and communications. And it's been part of, it's in my DNA, I guess.
So where did you go to school?
I went to Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey, and then I went to NYU for a master's in New York City.
And what did you study for a master's?
Well, a master's with communications and education. And I got a job at a community college doing their audio visual. And then I got married and moved to Vermont and got a job at Dartmouth doing two-way microwave communications for grand rounds, medical stuff. It was Dartmouth Hospital, Dartmouth Mary Hitchcock Hospital at Dartmouth.
So that was kind of like a remote learning in those days if you were running microwave links?
Yeah, it's what we're doing now, only we had to do it by microwave. And then eventually we started doing it on satellite.
Oh, interesting.
And now this is, people do it on their smartphones. But we shared grand rounds and actually did two-way consultations. I mean, Dartmouth is the tertiary hospital for rural New England. Between Boston and Montreal, Dartmouth and Hanover was the biggest hospital. And we had a lot of smaller hospitals that were affiliated with it. And the doctors would see patients. They'd share their educational rounds. And it was a fun job.
That's amazing. Well, I remember being at UC Santa Barbara 40 years ago, and they did distance learning, is what they called it, over microwave links as well, from Santa Barbara down to Ventura. For some reason, universities could actually get licenses for microwave links.
Yeah, we got some funding, federal grants and stuff at Dartmouth to do this. And we actually, they were seeing patients. I mean, they were doing dermatology consults.
Yeah, at the time, it was quite amazing. What was Core Communications?
Well, I worked at Dartmouth till 84. I just got tired of working for somebody. So I started my own business and ended up, I went into the friend of mine who was a ham. I mean, hams, like meeting you, Eric, and Howard, it's just great. It's a fraternity. And there's a certain, camaraderie or level of trust because we've all been through, we have the same interests. It's people that they don't quite understand it, but it's always been a real joy in my life. So a ham friend of mine was in the big satellite dishes. I mean, these are the 12-foot satellite dishes. And in those days, this was in 84, in rural Vermont, there was no good TV. I mean, when you aim that dish up at a geosynchronous satellite and this crystal clear picture came in versus the snowy,
right?
It was like magic. So he and I opened a satellite business together, and I did that from 84 to 88. And we used to advertise on radio. And one day, the salesman that used to sell us the radio ads came in and says, "You guys seem really interested in radio. The place I'm working at is for sale."
The radio station that he was working at was for sale.
Right, the radio station. And it was the roaring 80s. I mean, money was, we had a good business and stuff. So I said, "Well, how much do you want?" So they told me, and I said, "Oh, sure, that sounds like fun." So I bought an AM daytimer. Okay, that's the first mistake. An AM daytimer.
So you're going to have to explain that for the audience. An AM daytimer means what? That it shuts down at nighttime?
It's in the AM band, which already was almost dying then, but dead now. Not always, but a little bit. And a daytimer, exactly. It was only 250 watts in the day and 24 watts at night.
So it's really a local station.
Local. I don't think you could hear it down the street, but it had a construction permit which enabled it to go to 10,000 watts. So it became the highest powered AM station in New Hampshire at 10,000 watts, but it still didn't have any nighttime authority. So it was still 24 watts at night. Daytime was AM standard for active minds, is what we used to tell people. So I got that, and that was like hemorrhaging money. I thought that I could hire a general manager and I just stay in the satellite business. And we had multiple stores, but every couple of weeks they'd say, "Well, we need another $10,000 or whatever." And eventually, I said, "I got to get out of the satellite business and run the radio station." I did, and lucky I was able to get back in shape. And we ended up with 6 different stations that we owned and operated, and some of them were FMs, and turned things around. So it was fun.
What was the format of that original station?
Well, I always liked talk radio. We were one of Rush Limbaugh's first affiliates. Matter of fact, we were one of his first 50 affiliates in 1980. When did I sign that on? 1988. Rush went on the air in August of 1988, and we signed on in September of 1988. And I'd never heard of Rush, but I liked talk radio, and I went to ABC, who was syndicating him at the time, and asked what they had. And there's some people I knew, like Dr. Joy Brown, and she's dead. Rush has died. Most of the people I had, Bruce Williams is gone.
Oh, I love Bruce Williams. From Chicago, right? He was a mayor of some suburb of Chicago at some point.
Bruce Williams, he was everybody's uncle. He used to sit and give advice every night.
I loved listening to Bruce Williams because he was also a business maven. He was an entrepreneur, and he would give business advice.
He would, actually, the best quote I ever heard that I use all the time, Bruce Williams used to say on his radio show, everyone says we're all equal. And Bruce Williams says that's really not the case. He says there's only one thing that we're all equal about. You've got a better voice. You've got more computer knowledge. Someone else is stronger. Someone else can play an instrument. So we're not equal. The only thing that we're equal about is we all have 24 hours in the day, and it's what we do with that 24 hours that makes the difference. That was sort of his key advice, and I thought made an impression on me at least.
I did a lot of driving between college and home in the middle of the night, and so Bruce was always a companion.
Bruce Williams was there. Larry King, we had all those guys.
Well, I remember in the 80s when talk went conservative, people who were generally in the middle of the road, they lost an audience for some reason. They lost market share, and all of a sudden they're gone, and then you see conservative talk. I don't know where they went. It was an interesting transformation. It happened in the Denver market, too, which is where I was at the time.
Well, Rush revolutionized talk radio. I mean, whether you like his politics or not, and I have a lot of friends from when I was at the medical school who used to see, we go to fairs and I have a life-size cutout of Rush, and we'd have people take their picture with Rush. And anyhow, they used to almost spit at me because what happened? Well, we thought you were a normal person. Now you're running Rush Limbaugh. And I used to say to them, besides my own politics, I say, listen, I'm in the business of attracting listeners. That's the business, because I sell ads to clients who want listeners, and Rush brings you listeners, whether you like them or not.
I'm a huge talk radio fan, and that's probably why I do a podcast, because I grew up listening to Michael Jackson in Los Angeles.
Michael Jackson was great. We aired Michael Jackson. He was phenomenal. He moved to Seattle or something, didn't he?
I thought he was still in L.A. When I started the podcast, I reached out to Michael Jackson to get some advice, and he wrote me back. What a nice guy he was, and I loved listening to him.
I'm sorry, when he left syndication, Michael Jackson was probably one of the best hosts. You know who talk about ham radio and talk radio? You remember Gene Shepard?
I never heard Gene Shepard in California growing up, but I hear that he was absolutely fantastic on the East Coast.
He used to send Morse code on the air. Have you ever heard him since then, Eric?
I've listened to some of his stuff that's available on YouTube.
Yeah, Gene Shepard. I saw Gene Shepard. On Saturday night, he used to go to the Limelight in Greenwich Village. And I went to the Limelight to see Gene Shepard. He was great. It was a ham. He died in Florida, unfortunately, but everyone gets out of here alive.
Well, I think everybody dies in Florida, don't they?
It's heaven's waiting.
I don't think there's a California equivalent. At least growing up in California, only had one season. You didn't have snowbirds that would head from like New York to Florida during the winter.
You probably have people from Alaska that came down to California.
That could be. I don't remember them. No, they might have gone to Arizona.
Yeah, California's got so much more to offer. It's got the coast and everything.
Yeah, it did. At the time, I think it did. Okay, so I understand that you decided, at least in one of your properties, that you actually wanted to have a 50,000-watt station and an antenna tower that was larger than the city ordinance. How did that go? I thought that was a very interesting legal precedent.
Yeah, that's how I met Fred Hopengarden. And Fred is K1VR. Best thing in the world is I never built that 50,000 watt because I would have been hemorrhaging again. Yeah, I had a CP, a construction permit, to build a 50,000 watt station. The town wouldn't allow me to put a tower up. It was on 720 kilohertz. And the town's height limitation for towers was 34 feet. And so I went to the zoning and they turned us down. And then I appealed it to the district court, whatever, county court, got turned down. And then we appealed the county court's decision to the New Hampshire Supreme Court and won. And it became precedent. I mean, I said to the town, I said, look, 34 feet, I put the tower up myself. I mean, I climb it, I put it up myself, we do it tomorrow. I don't want to put up a 200-foot tower, but the FCC minimum, requirement for radiation and pattern, et cetera, because you had to control the pattern, is 200 feet. Actually, it was 260 feet. And I needed 5 of them because it was directional. Good news is we never built it.
I read the legal decision that Fred had gotten for you, and he writes a note as a comment on it that the FCC overriding the local jurisdiction could have some benefit to people who are in HOAs where there's an FCC now legal precedent overriding the local authorities. I thought that was interesting, except I think HOAs are private property.
Not municipalities.
Municipalities, right.
I don't give the FCC any credit. First thing, because we asked them to be a friend of the court and come in on our side because I was following FCC criteria. 34-foot antenna would be lovely.
To be legal and safe.
We would base load it, put a loading coil on it, whatever. But the FCC refused to weigh in on it. They would not be a friend of what they call it. I don't know. There's a way of joining a litigation, and they didn't want anything to do with it. So I had to represent myself and pay all the legal bills, et cetera. So it was, but Fred did a good job.
In the end, did you end up putting up any kind of station there? It had an interesting call sign, by the way, right?
WUVR.
Ah, well, what is WQTH?
That was the call sign. When you get a construction permit, you have to sign a call.
Right.
So I figured WQTH was a good call sign for those people who would understand it.
So you didn't have to have an FCC call.
Well, that's an FCC call.
So you got WQTH from the FCC as a AM broadcast license?
But it never got licensed because it never got built.
I see.
Okay. It had a construction permit, but never got built. And I think the construction permit, it's probably 20 years old, but never really got thrown out by the FCC. It's still in FCC limbo.
Oh, that's interesting.
Floating around in the swamp someplace.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today podcast is now value for value instead of advertiser supported. This allows me to have any kind of ham radio discussion with my guests without potential censorship or sponsor pressure. Value for value means that in exchange for the value that you receive from my efforts to make this podcast, you support the podcast at any level that you think is valuable to you. It is this support that convinces my XYL that I should continue to make the QSO Today podcast commercial-free. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSOTodayCommunity.com website. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors do influence the content and comments in the podcast. Commercial-free allows greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think it is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I'm not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon anymore, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages, beginning with episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. There is a new section where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This list is generated automatically from my membership system. Keep in mind that there are people who have made donations who have asked not to be listed and they don't show up there. I want to thank Mike Morgan, N0MPM, who renewed his annual subscription at $100. Mike Wing, KN6LJF, $100 annual subscription. And Roy Philemon, KT4EM, for his $25 contribution. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you can support the QSO Today podcast indirectly by using our Amazon link on the show notes page before going into Amazon to shop. Amazon gives us a small commission when you use our link to go into Amazon. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of ham radio since 2014. It will all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a sponsor or make a donation today. And now back to our QSO Today. So how long were you in the broadcast business?
Well, it's like dog years. 27, 28 years. I sold in 2017.
So you were involved throughout the rest of your career then?
It really was the longest career stint that I served the most time in broadcasting.
Did you love it?
I don't think you'd do it if you didn't like it, but it's very, you're on 24/7, 365 days a year. And if something goes wrong and you're at a small market radio, they call the owner and then the owner has to maybe call the engineer. But lots of times I just, I knew enough to be dangerous. So 2:00 in the morning, I'm heading into a transmitter site to find out what the heck happened.
You were also the broadcast engineer?
No, I had several contract engineers, all of which were hams.
All of these stations were up in the Northeast?
4 in New Hampshire, 2 in Vermont.
Well, I think the TVRO business was destined to be wiped out by cable television, ultimately, right? And then by DirecTV and the small dish.
Oh, yeah, the small dish.
I was in the cable TV business, so I could tell you that we worried a lot about the small dish.
You were in the cable, yeah. Well, and cable's getting wiped out by internet.
Right, fiber.
Fiber, yeah.
We always had to worry. It was always a predator food business, depending upon whether you were the predator or the food.
Well, Charlie Ergen at DirecTV?
I didn't know him, no, but I had heard of him, yeah.
Well, Charlie Ergen, and when we were in the satellite business, he had a thing called EchoLink. That's
EchoStar.
EchoStar. Well, it was out in Colorado, I think.
Yes, it was. He also had the company that made the receivers. There was one other company that went along with it. They were paired together.
Right. Well, then Charlie went. Charlie and I've only met him once. I don't know him. He would never recognize me. But we were, you go to the satellite conventions, and Charlie Ergen EchoStar was a big. We bought equipment from him.
Right.
But he evolved. He went in from selling dishes to small town retailers to the small dish. He owns Dish Network.
Right. That's right.
Now he's in cellular.
I was in the radio paging business, too. And you saw the mobile telephone guys, kind of morph into paging. They had to kind of morph into cellular. And if they were large enough, maybe they invested in New Vector Cellular or something.
Or they got bought out.
Then they got bought out. And the same thing happened in the cable television business. You had hundreds of cable television operators, small guys, that would run 4 or 5 towns.
And Comcast bought them.
Now there's Comcast and AT&T, or there's maybe 3 or 4 major players now.
Yeah, I forget who Comcast I hate.
At the time when I was in the cable TV business, they were kind of limited to the Philadelphia area.
Right, the Philadelphia base. Yeah. So did you run cable systems, or what were you?
I was doing operations for my boss's retirement company. So I worked for a guy named Monty Rifkin, and Monty Rifkin was one of the founders of the cable television industry. He worked for Blumenthal in New York, who made the teleprompter. This guy invented teleprompters, but he also had teleprompter cable. And a guy named Bill Daniels from Denver kind of took this young Monty Rifkin, who in the early 60s was a 30-year-old CPA who was working for teleprompter, took him to Denver, and they started the whole industry. So Monty ended up becoming American Cable Television, and then he sold that to Time Warner and decided, I'll never be in a public business again, and he opened a small cable company in Denver that had 500,000 subs, and I managed 68,000 of his subs in the Midwest.
500,000 subs is a nice number.
It was a great number. That's one of the reasons I came to Israel.
That's not a small company.
As far as a cable television MSO, the corporate headquarters was not more than maybe 40, 50 employees. But I had 90 head ends in the Midwest. Very small places like Centralia, Illinois, and Mount Vernon, Illinois, places like that. It was a fascinating business, and it was an amazing time because right about 99 is when he sold out. My job was to get those systems up to the most we could sell them for. We sold those systems for $3,400 a sub.
Oh, they sold for individual subs, not for multiple.
By the subscriber. And they went to Charter Cable in St. Louis. That was the highest price ever paid for per sub.
You can just do the math. 500,000 times $3,400.
It was a great exit. For me, it was a tiny exit, but it got me here. Anybody that listens to episode 200 of the QSO Today podcast knows that my wife woke me up in the middle of the night and she says, what we could do with the money? And I said, well, what could we do with the money? She says, we could make our house larger and buy 2 Lexuses, which is what people were doing in Denver at the time. And I said, well, you want to do that? And she said, no, I want to move to Israel. And that's how we ended up coming.
What year was that now?
2000.
2000. Good decision.
It was a great decision, but everything just came together at once. And the industry was very exciting at that time. And of course, we were starting to get overbuilt by DirecTV, which really affected subscription numbers.
Direct and Dish, right? They were both.
Dish Network and DirecTV. And that whole business was debt funded. The MSO would borrow from Bank of Boston $500 million. So the job was actually to guarantee cash flow growth, 13% a year cash flow growth. So Monty ran all these systems by the numbers. We spent 6 months doing budgets for the next year, and then we died on the numbers. And it was a great business.
That's what happens when you get so big, because it becomes almost like banking. Radio is that same way, cable is that way. And, it becomes, the numbers become the driving force. And it didn't when you probably started. You were interested in the technology and how do I set up a head end, and to kind of get a couple more channels and, where I get the bandwidth. I'm going to put FM on the, in between there and stuff. And then it becomes, which any business does, if it gets big.
I was only there for about a year and a half, but I launched the first cable modem systems in America.
The internet modem?
Yeah, in Centralia, Illinois, using COM21 ATM modems at the time. So, and then we launched the digital tier, thing called HITS at that time. So I was involved in that. We were taking systems that were 30 channels up to 450 megahertz, which was 60 channels.
That was just amazing.
Oh, it was an amazing year and a half. It was a roller coaster ride. Anyway, let's talk more about what you are doing, because anybody can hear my story. If they've listened to the QSO Today podcast long enough, they could probably put it all together. What I'm interested in is in looking at your QRZ page, you have a place in Maine, right? And you have a remote station somewhere in New England. And you also live in Fort Myers, as well as now you're in Jerusalem. So can you talk a little bit about, started with a station in Maine, how did you get there, and what do you do there, and how do you operate from there?
Well, Maine, my wife died 7 years ago, and but we bought that Maine place as a vacation home. And Maine is a wonderful state. I'm sorry we didn't discover it until I went to Maine once when we first married in 1973 or so, and wasn't impressed and never went back, even though Vermont is relatively close. But Maine is just a wonderful state. It's got tremendous coastline, and climate's not the best. But So we bought a vacation home in Maine, and now I hope to go back there in the summer when Jerusalem gets a little too hot.
See, I always think of Maine as being snow-covered. So the picture that you have on QRZ, that must be a summer picture, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's on the coast, so that the salt water takes care of the snow and the winds and stuff. We don't have. I've got a hex beam there from K1. It's VHX hex. He's out of New Hampshire. K1NH. VHX, I believe, is the make, and it's K1NH. A guy named Dave. He makes the most rugged hex beams I've ever seen.
So it survives the Maine winter.
It will survive anything. He's a machinist. He races cars or something. It's heavy. That's the only problem. It's a heavy hex beam. Most of those hex beams are pretty light. It performs very, very well. And I put up a crank up aluminum tower, and it works. It's nice. It works well. But my favorite is my remote station in Vermont. I mean, Fred actually has been there. Fred's actually been to all my QT.
But it looks like that's a travel trailer.
It is. And Vermont is I bought a beat up old trailer for $3,000 and put my ham station in it.
So it's on a little piece of property.
Oh, it's 15 acres. It's right across from where I had it was stupid to do it there, but I had a station across 1,000 feet away, an AM station, 5,000 watt AM station, and an FM translator on that. So this tower, I'm actually higher than my old tower. But here's a ham story. So I first put up my antennas. I've got an opti beam there, which really works out very nice. But I wanted to tune it up. So I took my antenna analyzer and I put it on the damn antenna. And the SDPR was just like, I said, it's a heck of a job to put it up. Turns out that I was using a cheap MFJ antenna analyzer, and the RF from the 5,000 watt station 1,000 feet away was just overloading that antenna analyzer. You couldn't do a thing. I had to tune the antenna at night because the AM had to be a daytimer across the street as well. So, but the remote station has really revolutionized ham radio for me. I have it here in Jerusalem with me. I can work. I have it in my car. I can work 160 through 6 meters anywhere.
Right, and you're using, just so that people know, we're talking right now, we didn't use Skype this time, we're using Google Meet, and you're using your cell phone as a hotspot.
That's right, it's a mobile hotspot. I'm using...
for us to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's working. I find when I use it with the computer must have better buffering. If we were just doing this on the cell phone, I think it would drop out more, but the computer has enhanced buffering or whatever, it doesn't seem to drop out.
What are you using to do the remote control? What is the station at your remote station?
It's a TS480, which has the removable head. You know, the head is about this big. It looks like K3. It's a removable head. Got the knobs just like, and I'm using remote rig, which is the Scandinavian black box, basically. So the head is here with me in Jerusalem. It goes to a black box that connects, in this case, to my Galaxy Samsung phone, tethered to that.
It's connected to your phone using Wi-Fi?
I have it tethered to the phone.
With like a USB cable?
It's a USB-C, and it actually goes right into the phone. I wanted to use my iPhone, but you can't tether an iPhone to get data. You can tether it to your laptop to transfer pictures and stuff like that, but it doesn't do data.
Okay, so you're using a Samsung Galaxy, you're using the remote rig and the control head on your side.
Right.
And then, obviously, the TS480 doesn't have a control head in the remote station anymore because you have it.
Yeah. Right. And it just, in the remote station is the transmitter receiver box. I've got the high powered one, the 200 watt, and I have some external antenna tuners, some MFJ antenna tuners, and I can switch antennas, change bands, work FT8, AM, FM, sideband, CW, no lag, no distortion.
You're a long way right now. You're at least 5,800 miles from the East Coast.
7,500.
7,500 in Jerusalem. So what other equipment do you have in that site in order to either monitor what's going on? Are you using any other kinds of technology besides the remote rig?
I have a camera. I have a Wise camera that's looking at the equipment. And I have a timer to reboot the routers every once in a while. Not too smart. Vinikoor says, I'm going to put a Wemo switch on it.
Yeah.
I could shut it off with the Wemo switch, but you can't turn it back on because the switch depends on the internet. So instead, I just got a mechanical timer and shut it off every night at 2 o'clock. Of course, now they're shutting it off at 2 o'clock. It's actually in the morning here. I didn't adjust it for the 7-hour difference.
You had to move that little tooth on the timer that's going around there on this mechanical timer. Yeah.
2 o'clock in the morning when you're in the East Coast is no big deal. 2 o'clock in the morning here, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast is 7 o'clock or it's 9 o'clock in the morning here. So if I want to run my remote rig, it's off the air for an hour because the timer is recycling the router. I only did it because other hams who were friends of mine in the area, and they occasionally would have to go up to the camper and unplug my router, which was really unfair. So we put a timer on it. Other than that, it's been bulletproof. I mean, I've been doing it for at least 3 years now.
You're also running that remote rig from your car. I saw that you've got a picture of the thing on your dash.
Right on the dash. Works great. Yeah. I tried HF Mobile because I go back and forth between Florida and Maine, and it's a long ride. I think I worked one person on 1,800 miles with my mobile rig and an antenna in the back, and but of course the band conditions weren't that good. But with this, I'm working an OptiBeam, for my mobile rig, and in the car it goes right through I'm hard of hearing, but it goes to my car stereo. I have a Subaru. It goes to the car stereo, and it's like fidelity. It's great. It works out really well.
You have to be careful in Israel is that if they catch you with a microphone in your hand,
it's illegal.
You can get a 1,000 shekel fine.
Well, I don't have a car here in Israel. But...
Good, yeah. I have to drop the pickle in my lap if somebody comes by.
Can't you wear a headset with you?
Yeah, I could wear a headset. I have to come up with a push-to-talk arrangement that will work with my Plantronics Bluetooth headset. Then it'll be fine. Like some kind of a button on my steering wheel.
Al makes a push-to-talk button. They make a floor push-to-talk button and a hand push-to-talk.
Yeah, I think if it was just on the steering wheel or something like that, it would be fine. The thing is I've been running radios in the car for 50 years. The police have microphones, and the taxis have microphones, and the buses have microphones. What I don't understand is why
ham radio can't.
Ham radio can't.
Actually, I think in the States, hams are exempt. At least it depends on every state, but I think in New Hampshire it is. But seatbelts are exempt in New Hampshire. So.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
The motto in New Hampshire is live free or die. It's on the license plate.
It comes all the way from the American Revolution.
Live free or die?
I think so.
I guess so. It's certainly no helmet laws on motorcycles.
What's your favorite operating mode?
I don't know. I go back between CW, sideband, and FT8. I would say if I had to pick one and only one, I'd pick CW. Not that I'm good at it, but it's my comfort zone.
There's something about it. I find it also CW. I like listening to CW. Maybe because I'm listening to talk radio all day long, right? It's nice to have something, different to put in your ears. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in Fort Myers? Because you were talking today, as we're having coffee, that you also live in Fort Myers. You have a little bit of property there, and you're also an HOA. How do you operate there in Fort Myers, and what are you operating there?
Well, in Fort Myers, it's a small HOA, just 20 homes. They're all single-family homes. So it's not we don't have a very informal group, and my neighbors are very nice. First, I put up a gap vertical, which is a Florida vertical, Florida-made vertical. It's a 40 through 10-meter vertical dipole. But then I got a little bit more brazen, and I put up telephone poles. I got about a half acre of land, and I put up telephone poles at each of the corners of the land, and I ran a loop around the telephone poles. So I've got a 450-foot loop. It's really not resonant, but I can run it on 160 through 10 meters. And I feed it with open wire feed lines, which I made myself. But on each pole, I put a birdhouse. And I face the birdhouse towards each of my neighbors. And it's attracted birds, and my neighbors don't know. They think I'm some sort of, what's the correct word for?
You're an ornithologist.
Yeah. One of them said, what kind of birds are you trying to attract? I said, I don't really care. I just like to take care of the birds. So, and it's really, neighbors would never complain.
And what's the rig there? You have different rigs in these places, in each of these places?
I was driving radios back and forth, which got a little old. So I have 7300s, ICOM 7300s, both in Florida and Maine. And then I have, in Florida, I bought a Palstar amplifier, which I rarely use, but I have a Palstar LK1, LAK1. It's the one, it's like they say it's a kilowatt. I mean, I never run it more than 500 watts if I use it.
It's my understanding you could run the 7300s remotely using software?
Yeah, what was it called? Win for ICOM. That's a neat program. I don't know if you ever used it. It's an amazing program. But I'm a knob turner. I want. I mean, I like to turn the knobs, and Win for ICOM. You got to do on your laptop.
I'm pretty sure that you can get a USB knob.
Yeah, you can get one knob that you can press and stuff like that.
Yeah, that you can go up and down the band with it.
The 480, I bought 5 of them, and whenever I see them in a Hamfest, I buy them because I sent one in for repair once, and it cost me like $500 to repair. You can buy them at the Hamfest for $500-$600. So I've got 5 of them. One in my car, one I carry with me wherever I travel, and the others are spares because I don't want to go through buying them again. And it's obsolete. You can do the same thing with the ICOM 7100. That has a detachable head. The TS2000 has a detachable head. If you want the feel of the knobs in front of you, and that's a good, I like the detachable head. And Remote Rig is a tremendous piece of software, or not software, but black boxes.
Right. I think it's pretty terrific that you're able to do what you're doing and that you've actually settled on a standard, the TS480 as a standard. I kind of do that with other kinds of radios. I collect the same one so that if I break one,
you've got it.
I brick it. I've got another one that I can use and put it in place, and I'm not down very long.
At my age, I got the 7300, and I just bought a DX DX10 or something like that. Is that the Yaesu radio?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, the learning curve is tremendous. I mean, the books are, you got to go to school. I mean, I grew up with a DX35. You put a crystal in, you turn on the plate and press the key. Menu after menu after menu, and set this bandwidth and that nuance. It's just not for an old guy like me.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Do you have a ham radio workbench, Bob?
I did put one in Maine, but I'm not that much of a technician. I mean, I know enough to screw something up, and then I usually call on friends who are a lot smarter to say, hey, listen, I can't figure this out. What's going on?
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
There's just so many different angles. I mean, FT8, I never thought I'd like it, but it's fun. It's a new technology. I go to Hamfest, you see these guys talking to satellites and to the International Space Station. The hobby's changed, but it's still, there's something basic to it. I don't know. It just still feels comfortable. I don't feel like it's left me behind. Other than, quite honestly, I could never have gotten the Remote Rig working if it wasn't for younger guys who know how to program stuff.
And know the networking side of it.
You got to have a virtual, I don't know, a DMZ or something like that.
A DNS?
DNS. I mean,
are you using VPN to do it, or?
No, we're using the public internet. At this camper on 15 acres in rural Vermont, I've got fiber right to the camper.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Did you have to run it yourself?
1 gigabyte fiber right to the camper. It's the best internet I have anywhere.
Well, I could tell you that once you get settled in Jerusalem, you can get fiber optic service. It's a game changer.
Oh, yeah. We didn't know we were going to be able to do this because of the limitations of the network.
I was actually trying to find somebody's living room today that you could actually go to actually do this. And fortunately, it's a Thursday night in Jerusalem, and everybody goes out for something.
The weekend sort of starts tomorrow.
No, the weekend starts tonight. Thursday night is like Friday night,
Right. Friday's a half day of work.
Or it's getting ready for Shabbat. Thursday night has a different energy in Jerusalem. It's the movie night, the concert night, the theater night.
Well, Jerusalem has a different energy than any city I've ever. I'm not a city person, but if I had to pick a city, and I have picked a city, Jerusalem would be the city. I mean, it's an amazing city. It's diverse, it's friendly, it's vibrant. You can't say enough about it.
Well, you're going to find that the longer you're there, the more people that you'll know. I mean, your network will grow very large.
Yeah. I mean, I was sitting on a bench today after we left you guys, and I had my Nefesh B'Nefesh hat on, and some lady comes and says, I got the same hat. And she came from California, actually, 5 weeks ago. Well, March 1st, she said.
Just for the listeners, Nefesh B'Nefesh is an organization that helps, I guess, English speakers move to Israel.
I don't think it's just English speakers. Do you think? I think they operate in France.
Maybe.
It's an interesting question. I'll have to ask them.
They weren't available when we came. As a resource, we didn't have them as a resource when we moved here.
Anybody of coming to Israel, if you're an English speaker, Nefesh B'Nefesh, which means soul to soul, is that right?
Right. It's a great organization. The interesting thing, maybe this is interesting to the listeners, as Americans, we're not used, except for the Department of Motor Vehicles, and maybe if you get audited by the IRS, we're not used to dealing with bureaucracies, right, for the most part. Unless you're a new immigrant to America, in which case then you're dealing with all of the bureaucracy. So when you come here as a person who thinks that the worst thing you've ever dealt with in terms of a government bureaucracy is the Department of Motor Vehicles in your state, you come here and you realize that you have to deal now with a whole bunch of different ministries which have embedded bureaucracies that are 60, 70 years old. And you never have the right paperwork. They'll say, oh, in order to get this next step, and they give you a list of all these documents. You get all these documents that you can't read because they're in Hebrew and you're an English reader. You bring all these documents back. You know, it's like bringing the witch's broom back to the wizard. You bring all this stuff in to this government agency, and this lady looks it over. Usually it's a lady, looks it over and says, you're missing this document. And you'll say, but it's not on your list. Oh, but it wasn't on my list, but it's important. You must have this document. So you go back and forth, and my wife, fortunately, was doing this while I was traveling back and forth when we first came. And finally, it got to the point where she would just break down in tears in the office. And finally, that was enough to get the stamp to get this through. So Americans who aren't used to working with bureaucracy, when they come here, it's overwhelming. And Nefesh B'Nefesh was this organization that said, we know how this bureaucracy works. We'll take you by the hand and lead you through it. And they've made it so much easier.
It was 23 years ago when you made Aliyah and immigrated. I found it nothing but streamlined.
It's a finely oiled machine. Nefesh B'Nefesh is almost 20 years old.
Nefesh B'Nefesh is unbelievable. But I hired one of your neighbors as a Aliyah advisor. He has made this so easy for me. It's unbelievable. I just got a text from a friend in the States, and they said they think about me and they're worried about all the bombing and the violence. I feel safer here in Jerusalem and in Israel than I do in any city, anywhere in the States, with the exception of Vermont, where I raised my family, and it was a small town of 3,000 people, and it was in the middle of nowhere. I can't, you walk on the street 10, 12, 1 in the morning here, and you feel safe. It's an incredible country, and I can't thank the IDF and the Israeli.
We don't have the same kind of street violence. Jerusalem, you can walk. It's not the city that never sleeps. Jerusalem does tend to roll up its carpets at a certain point in the evening, but you can walk anywhere, almost anywhere in the city, and not have any problems. And the same is true in any of the other major cities, Tel Aviv, Haifa. We don't have the same kind of crime.
You've been here for 23 years. I've visited many times, but I've never seen,
You'll drink a lot of coffee, Bob. You have to be careful.
I do drink a lot of coffee. Today I've never spent so much time in a coffee house in my life. It's great. It's great.
Drink the coffee and avoid the pastries. Then you'll be fine.
Or at least walk to the coffee house.
Yeah, walk there, burn off the pastries that you'll eat during the coffee. Anyway, do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams, Bob, after you're over 60 years in ham radio?
Well, for new hams, I would say try to learn CW. I think it's if you were to use the psychological terms, the Maslow hierarchy of needs, CW is the baseline of of ham radio. I mean, it gives you can communicate with two wires just going like that. It's an international language, and learn CW.
And it's good for the brain.
I hope so. I mean, mine's not too well, but learn CW and returning hams. Just join a club. Ask, hams. I've never met a ham that wasn't friendly and willing to help. I think it's just part of the fraternity. People get in it and they're willing to share their knowledge. And so if you've been out of it for a while, join a club and just say, listen, I need help. I got a ICOM 7300. I don't know how to turn it on, and there's YouTube. YouTube has been phenomenal for us old guys. They got people to take you through every knob.
I can tell you that the reason that we know each other is through ham radio, through an introduction. And believe it or not, you are now a significant member of the Jerusalem amateur radio operators, meaning that you might be 20% of the Jerusalem amateur radio operators.
I'm honored to be here in Israel. It's really been a life.
Your coming to Jerusalem as a ham radio operator has a significant impact on the number of ham radio operators that are active in Jerusalem.
That's great.
So you've met 2 of the 5 or 6 that are in Jerusalem. Now, there's probably a lot more. They've kind of all gone quiet. So you're making a significant impact just by being there.
Morning. My pleasure, my joy to be here. Thank you, Eric. You've been great.
Bob, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the QSO Today podcast 73, and I'll see you on Independence Day.
I look forward to it. 73 is to you, and all the best. And, thanks for having me.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bob. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W3CFE in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.